The engine cut out at exactly 9:078, and that was the last quiet second anyone at that checkpoint would get for the next 14 months. The red carbon fiber Ducati rolled to a stop precisely where the checkpoint tape told it to, not an inch over the line, and that precision was the first thing Sergeant Brent Keller decided to hold against its rider. "Place your bets," Keller said to his partner, loud enough that 3 other officers heard him. "That thing is not where it's supposed to be. Look at him. Something doesn't match." Mark Cole killed the engine, dropped the kickstand, and rested both gloved palms flat against the tank, exactly the way his father had drilled into him before he was old enough to legally ride anything faster than a bicycle. Hands where they can see them. Voice calm. "Never move fast. Never move slow enough to look like you're hiding something either." I didn't argue, didn't reach for anything. He simply waited, visor down, while 2 officers studied him like a problem they'd already decided how to solve. Officer Dale Vance approached first, one hand resting, not gripping, just resting, which was somehow worse on his sidearm. "Step off the bike." Then I ask why? No answer, just a flat palm cutting the air. An order repeated without explanation. For 1 full second, something in Mark's chest pulled tight. His fingers closed hard around the helmet strap. A flinch too small for either officer to register. Too old and too familiar to be about this stop alone. It was the same tightening he'd felt at 14. Walking home with a pack of gum in his pocket, when a patrol car slowed beside him for no reason anyone ever named. Hunt let it go the way he had learned to breathe out. Released the strap. Swung off the bike with his hands raised. "This bike matches a theft report filed for the event," Vance said, like he was reading a script he hadn't bothered to memorize. "What's the report number?" Silence. "What's the plate on the stolen vehicle?" More silence. Then, instead of an answer, "Hand over the keys." Mark produced everything without hesitation. Registration. Insurance. The original purchase invoice from Modena. The notarized ownership transfer. The limited edition certificate cross-referenced to the frame. Every document had his name on it. Every serial number matched. Keller flipped through the stack like it personally offended him and asked for a deeper inspection anyway. Vance crouched by the frame and photographed the serial number at an angle so severe it bent the final digit into something that could, if you wanted it badly enough, look tampered with. Then he stood and announced it flatly, like reading a fact off a wall. "This serial number's been tampered with. Clean the lens and shoot it again. Under real light," Mark said, keeping his voice level. "I'll wait. It's not going anywhere." Vance didn't move to do it. That was how the story got built, not with a single lie either man consciously told, but with one small distortion stacked on another until, from the inside, it all looked like plain truth. He can't produce a clean explanation. He's stalling. This could be interstate transport of stolen property. Neither believed he was inventing anything. That was the dangerous part. Men who are certain they're right rarely check their work. Then Vance's flashlight caught something small and steady, blinking beneath the dash cluster. "That's a 2-way recording system," Mark said, before either could ask. "Cameras front and rear. Cabin mic. GPS. It auto-syncs to an encrypted server the moment the engine shuts off." It already started. A screen woke on the dash. G1%, 38%, 49%. Each number quietly locked in a piece of what had already been said, Keller's joke. Vance's refusal to reshoot the frame number pushing it somewhere neither officer could reach or delete later. Vance stepped toward the dash, fingers working toward the memory card slot. Mark's voice stayed even. "That's destruction of federal evidence. I'd think carefully before your hand finishes that motion." Near the gas station across the lot, a retired trade school teacher named Samuel Ortiz had already lifted his phone. "Arm steady, like he'd done this before. Hold the bike before he calls a lawyer," Keller said, loud enough to be caught clean on 2 devices at once. Samuel didn't lower his phone when Vance told him to. A tow truck from Summit Elite Recovery rolled in before the theft report had been confirmed by anyone. On its dashboard, half hidden by the visor, Mark caught the edge of a folded scrap of paper, pressed face down like someone had turned it over on purpose before he could read it. He filed the detail away and said nothing. "Hands behind your back," Vance said, stepping close enough that Mark could smell the coffee on his breath. "Obstruction. Possible possession of stolen property." Mark didn't resist, but before the cuffs clicked shut, he spoke clearly. aimed directly at the recorder he knew was running. My name is Mark Cole. It is 9:19. The officers present are Sergeant Brent Keller and Officer Dale Vance. We are at the Route 9 checkpoint outside Silver Ridge. I have not resisted a single instruction given to me. The recorder hit 100% the moment the cuffs closed. The icon on the dash turned from blue to green. Keller saw it happen. I watched the light change color right in front of him. He just didn't understand yet what that green light was about to cost him. If a story like this makes your blood boil in the best way, subscribe right now, because what happens to these two officers by the end of this video is going to feel very, very good. They didn't know it yet, but the report they were about to write already had a hole torn through the middle of it. Back at the station, Keller and Vance typed up exactly what they needed to be true. Mark Cole had failed to produce sufficient documentation. Han had delayed a routine inspection. Han had accessed a suspicious electronic device. Han had refused verbal commands. On paper, in official font, it'd read like procedure. What it left out was the dash telemetry proving the bike hadn't moved an inch, and Samuel's video showing full, immediate compliance, time-stamped in the corner. The first crack in their version had already opened wide enough to see through. Neither man had noticed yet. At the booking desk, a night shift officer ran Mark's name through the federal database. Expecting nothing, the screen returned. Federal identity restricted access. Keller leaned over her shoulder and stared, like the screen might change if he looked hard enough. What agency does he work for? Is he a federal agent? Mark sat at the booking bench, wrists still red from the cuffs. And answered without heat. My identity and ownership of that motorcycle have already been legally confirmed. Twice. By documents your own officer photographed and dismissed. My profession has no bearing on the legality of this arrest. I wasn't going to hand them the one card that could end this instantly. Not yet. Maybe never. If he had any say, because the moment he used that card, the point of what came next would collapse into something smaller. A judge got mistreated. Instead of a man got mistreated because of what people assumed the second they looked at him. Captain Douglas John walked out an hour later with what he called a resolution. Pay the towing fee. Pay the storage rate. Pay the inspection charge. Sign a statement confirming the stop was lawful. Waive, in writing, his right to complain. Do all four. And the bike would be released within 24 hours. Refuse anyone. And it could sit in impound for up to 45 days. The fee compounding daily. Mark understood exactly what the offer was. Not a settlement, a fork built to look generous. Stay quiet and pay, or stand on principle and pay far more. I didn't sign a single line. That night, alone in his car outside the impound lot, he let himself be tired for exactly as long as it took to feel it. A few seconds. No more. Then he wiped his face and drove home through the quiet outer edges of Atlanta, back into the version of himself no one at that checkpoint had ever seen. The garage light buzzed on over a workbench that hadn't changed in years. Mechanics' tools hung in painted outlines. A worn flight cap on a shelf. Hand-drawn engine schematics pinned above the bench. And a photograph of a man in Air Force coveralls. Grease on his knuckles. Grinning like he'd just solved a problem nobody else could crack. Leo Cole, former Air Force aircraft technician. Later, a trade school instructor who taught teenagers how an engine thought before he ever taught them how to fix one. Mark didn't go looking for anything of his father's that night. It was enough to remember. Leo bought this Ducati after the diagnosis. When the doctor started using words like stages instead of the word no one wanted to say, he'd built the two-way recording system himself, piece by piece, in this same garage, because a man his age riding that fast needed a witness, even if the witness was just a camera and a hard drive. He rode it for 11 months. Then he was gone, and the bike became the only thing left that still held the shape of his hands. That was why this story was never going to end with a settlement check from Silver Ridge. The next morning, attorney Helen Ward arrived to take his statement, and Samuel brought the raw footage, his hands still faintly unsteady, a full day later. Helen watched the clip twice, then asked a simple, procedural question. Did he want this escalated to someone with real authority over the department? Samuel answered first, scrolling local news on his own phone, his face changing all at once. Wait, he said. You're Judge Cole, federal court. I watched your confirmation hearing 2 years ago. The room went quiet. Mark didn't correct him, and didn't confirm it with pride either. If the only reason they hand this bike back is because they found out who I am, he said, they'll do the exact same thing to the next person who doesn't have a title to hide behind. Helen already had 2 other names on her legal pad by the end of that meeting. Calvin Price was 71, a retired watch repairman who'd spent 4 years restoring a 1970s Porsche alongside his late wife before cancer took her, finishing the car the year she died. Half memorial, half unfinished promise. It had been towed from a public lot near the same event, under a report nearly identical to Mark's. No confirmed theft, no matching plate, just suspicion. Dressed in procedure, Nora Benson worked the overnight shift cleaning a regional hospital. Her small pickup, the only thing standing between her and a 2-hour pre-dawn bus commute, had been flagged and towed from a gas station 2 miles from the checkpoint. That same week, she'd already missed one shift trying to get it back. Helen didn't say the other names yet. There were more: a man named Derek, a woman named Jasmine. Several out-of-state plates pulled the same week, but for now, they were only a pattern, a shape forming at the edge of a growing file. Then, almost as an afterthought, Helen found a business registration filed years earlier, listing the ownership behind Summit Elite Recovery. One name on it belonged to a man who happened to be Douglas John's brother-in-law. She didn't call it a conspiracy yet. It was one loose thread on an otherwise perfectly tailored sweater. Why? Helen said slowly. Would a local towing company have an exclusive contract with the exact department that keeps calling it? No one in that room had an answer. That question was about to become the most dangerous thing anyone had ever asked Douglas John to his face. By the time the story reached local news, Mark Cole had already made a decision that would cost him far more than it would ever save him, and he'd made it with his eyes wide open. He called his chief judge that same week and formally requested recusal from anything even remotely connected to Silver Ridge, any case touching the department, the officers involved, or Summit Elite Recovery, present or future. I didn't request a warrant through back channels. I didn't ask a court clerk to quietly pull a single file on his behalf. I didn't access sealed records. Didn't lean on his title to move one piece of this faster than it would move for anyone else standing in his exact position. It was the harder path, chosen on purpose, because he had the raw power to end this entire ordeal in a single afternoon phone call, and he refused to make that call. The moment he used his office to win his own case, every word he'd ever say about fairness afterward would be worth exactly nothing. Waiting turned out to be its own particular kind of punishment. Slow and grinding, with no end date attached to it. Ask yourself, if you had the power to end your own suffering in a single phone call, would you still refuse to use it? Just to prove the system should work without you. Comment 1 if you'd wait it out. Comment 2 if you'd use every advantage you had. Helen Ward and Samuel Ortiz sat across a small, cluttered table in Helen's cramped downtown office 2 days later. 2 printouts laid side by side between them, the towing dispatch log pulled from Summit Elite Recovery, and the official police report filed after the checkpoint stop. Helen uncapped a red pen and circled 2 timestamps, one on each page, her hand pressing hard enough to nearly tear the paper. Here, she said, tapping the dispatch log. Tow request generated at 9:14. She slid her finger across to the police report. Serial number flagged as suspicious. Entered into the system at 9:26. Samuel frowned, doing the math out loud, slower than he wanted to because his hands had started shaking again. The tow truck was already on its way before they'd even written down a reason to call it. The tow was dispatched 12 full minutes before Vance ever laid a hand on that frame number, Helen said, sitting back hard enough that her chair creaked. The theft report wasn't the reason they stopped him. It couldn't have been. The paperwork proves it lied about its own timeline. Samuel stared at the 2 pages like they might rearrange themselves into something less damning if he just looked long enough. So the theft report was written after the fact, to explain something they'd already decided to do. Neither of them said the word conspiracy out loud. It felt too large, too heavy, for the small room they were sitting in. But something in the air had shifted anyway. This wasn't one bad afternoon, one overzealous officer with a bad read on a stranger. This was a pattern with a deliberate shape, and they had just traced its first clean, Undeniable edge with a red pen. John got ahead of it before the ink on Helen's notes had even dried. He called a press conference on the courthouse steps, flanked by Keller and Vance in freshly pressed uniforms. Both men standing at attention like soldiers instead of the men who'd been caught on tape joking about a stranger's motorcycle. John delivered a version of events built entirely out of half-truths, stitched together with the kind of confident, procedural language that makes lies sound like policy. Mr. Cole, he said, had been uncooperative during a routine safety check. The vehicle's serial number had shown irregularities consistent with tampering. Officers had no way of knowing his professional background, nor should that have mattered to a lawful stop conducted in good faith. Mr. Cole, John said, his voice climbing into righteous indignation, was now leveraging a federal title to intimidate hard-working local law enforcement officers rather than allowing the department to complete a standard investigation. A reporter pressed Keller about the dashboard camera. He called it, without a flicker of shame, an unregistered data transmission device of unknown origin and unknown risk to officer safety. Another reporter asked Vance about the handcuffs. He said only that officer safety had required restraint until identity could be properly confirmed, as though the entire encounter had somehow been about protecting Mark, and not about controlling him. It was a masterclass in language doing the work that facts could never do on their own. And then the retaliation began fast, coordinated, and utterly, deniably legal on paper. It didn't touch Mark first. It came for everyone standing near him. Samuel was quietly removed from the volunteer committee running the Heritage Motor Ride. The explanation offered as vague and bloodless as possible, a scheduling conflict. Nothing personal. Thank you for your years of service. Within the same week, the trade school where Samuel had taught for 2 decades received an unscheduled funding audit. The exact kind of review that could stretch on for months and freeze grant money indefinitely, threatening programs that dozens of students depended on. Nora Benson, still waiting on her impounded pickup, was abruptly reassigned to an overnight shift schedule that made it functionally impossible for her to get to work at all, a quiet, bureaucratic method of pushing someone out the door without the paper trail of ever firing them. Helen received formal notice that her law office was being referred for a state bar review, triggered by an anonymous complaint that named specifics only someone inside the case could have known. And Mark himself was hit with a formal ethics complaint of his own, alleging that he had used his federal judicial position to threaten and intimidate local police officers during the course of a lawful arrest. None of it, taken piece by piece, could be proven as coordinated. All of it, taken together, was unmistakably deliberate. Then it got worse. A black SUV with no plates sat outside Helen's office for 3 consecutive nights. Engine idling. Headlights off. Gone by the time the sun came up, never quite long enough to justify a police report. Never quite short enough to be a coincidence. Samuel's mailbox was found pried open twice in 1 week. Nothing taken. Nothing except the sense that someone had wanted him to know they'd been there. And late one night, Mark's phone rang from a blocked number. And when he answered, no one spoke. He could just hear breathing on the other end. Unhurried. Patient. Like whoever was on the line wanted him to know exactly how easy it would be to find him if this went any further. I didn't tell Helen about that call for 2 full days. When he finally did, his voice shook for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun. I keep telling myself it's nothing, he said. And then I remembered that men who do nothing wrong don't usually need to remind the people fighting them how close they can get. This was the first night Mark let himself waver, not on whether to keep going, but on whether he had any right at all to keep dragging other people through the cost of his refusal to quit. He called Helen close to midnight, his voice quieter than she had ever once heard it in the 2 years she'd known him professionally. If I stopped right now, Mark asked, would they leave Nora alone? Would they leave Samuel's school alone? Helen didn't have an honest answer that could comfort him, and she was too good a lawyer to pretend otherwise. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. Mark, and I think that not knowing is exactly what they're counting on. That was the moment that made Mark human in a way no courtroom ever had, not a man standing above consequence, wielding a badge and a robe like twin shields, but someone lying awake in the dark, doing the terrible arithmetic of who else was paying, quietly and invisibly, for his refusal to stay silent. The break, when it finally came, arrived from somewhere none of them had been watching closely enough. Anna Monroe was 26 years old, a dispatch coordinator for Summit Elite Recovery, and she was putting her younger sister through her second year of college on a company scholarship she had once genuinely been proud to have earned. She reached out to Helen through an encrypted messaging app late one night, careful, visibly frightened even through text, asking for one single guarantee before she'd say another word that nothing she shared could ever be traced directly back to her. What she gave them, once she finally started talking, changed the shape of absolutely everything. The Ducati, she said, hands shaking as she typed, had been added to an internal target list a full 4 days before the weekend event, flagged and photographed long before it had ever come anywhere near that checkpoint. Keller had been personally sent a photo of the bike ahead of time, with instructions attached. Vance had been assigned, in writing, the specific task of learning to develop a stop reason that would hold up on paper. A2 truck had been pre-positioned along the exact route, waiting patiently on a vehicle that hadn't even been reported stolen yet because it was never, at any point, actually about theft. And then she typed the words that finally gave the entire operation a name: the Priority Asset Verification Program. It was, Anna explained over the course of a shaking, hour-long call with Helen on speakerphone, an internal scoring system. Vehicles weren't ranked by any genuine suspicion of crime. They were ranked by projected profitability. How likely was the owner to hire a lawyer and fight back? How far did they live from Silver Ridge? And how much would that distance discourage them from showing up to contest anything in person? Estimated household income, pulled from data brokers most people didn't even know existed. How dependent was the owner on this specific vehicle for their daily survival? Because desperate people settle fast. How quickly? Statistically, would this particular type of owner pay whatever it took just to make the entire problem disappear? Projected resale value at auction. If the owner never came back for it at all, Mark's bike had scored high on nearly every single category that mattered to the men running the program, an out-of-county owner. A vehicle valuable enough to be worth the legal risk of stopping it. A rider profile that statistically predicted a fast, quiet, embarrassed settlement. Han hadn't been stopped by mistake, or by bad luck, or by one officer's bad instinct on one bad morning. Han had been selected, chosen in advance, on a spreadsheet, by people who had never once met him. And suddenly, that folded scrap of paper Mark had glimpsed pressed face down on the tow truck's dashboard the morning of the checkpoint stopped being a stray, meaningless detail rattling around the back of his memory. It became something else entirely, one small, physical piece of a much larger machine he hadn't known existed until this exact moment. John had just unknowingly handed his own downfall to a 26-year-old dispatcher with a little sister she'd do anything to protect. Though it would take him a few more days to understand exactly what he'd lost. The company found out faster than anyone expected. John discovered internal access logs showing that Anna had pulled records she had no legitimate business reviewing. Summit Elite Recovery moved immediately and viciously threats of termination without severance. The promise of a lawsuit for breach of confidentiality that could follow her for years. A demand that the company-funded scholarship covering her sister's entire tuition be revoked on the spot. An accusation, delivered by a lawyer over the phone, that she had stolen proprietary company data. Anna panicked completely. She retracted everything she'd told Helen in a single frantic, tearful phone call, denied ever speaking with her at all, claimed she must have misunderstood whatever it was she thought she'd seen. Within hours, the internal servers went down for what the company called, in a bland internal memo, scheduled maintenance. The target list vanished without a trace. Several of the highest value impounded vehicles were quietly relocated out of the main lot overnight. Under cover of darkness, auction paperwork was carefully separated from ownership files, scrubbed clean of anything that could ever connect the two again. It was the first real, genuine defeat Mark's side suffered in this entire fight, and it was a devastating one. With no rescue arriving in the same breath to soften the blow, the single piece of evidence that could have blown the entire case wide open had just been erased by the one person brave enough to hand it over in the first place. Undone by fear for someone she loved more than she feared the truth she'd almost told. Then, almost as if to seal the wound shut for good, Summit Elite Recovery quietly returned the Ducati. No fee, no charges ever filed, no apology of any kind, just a release form waiting at the front desk, stamped with cold legal language, declaring that all disputes related to this matter are considered fully and finally resolved. Mark read it twice under the fluorescent office lights. Signed only the single line acknowledging he had physically received the vehicle, and drew a hard, deliberate line straight through the sentence claiming the dispute itself was over. That night, wiping down the leather seat alone in the quiet of his garage, his hand caught on something tucked beneath the edge of the cushion, a folded scrap of paper, worn impossibly soft at every crease, clearly hidden there long before any of this had ever begun. His father's handwriting. I didn't read it out loud. There was no one there to perform it for. He simply sat with it in the dim garage light. Alone, the only illumination coming from the same old desk lamp Leo Cole had once used to sketch engine diagrams late into the night, decades earlier. Nora still didn't have a truck to get her to work on time. And somewhere across town, in an office, Mark hadn't even thought to worry about that night. A phone call was about to arrive that he hadn't braced himself for at all. Helen, working now with a small, quietly assembled team of investigators, discovered that Summit Elite Recovery ran its entire dispatch operation through a third-party platform called Northline Fleet Systems, with servers physically hosted out of state, entirely beyond the department's reach or ability to tamper with. Every tow order, every timestamp, every dispatch instruction, every single edit made to a case file after the fact, all of it existed in a mirrored, independent copy that the department couldn't touch, no matter how hard John tried. They could delete their own internal records all they wanted. They could not reach across a state line into another company's servers and erase history that had already been written somewhere else. The FBI moved to file for a federal data preservation order before that window of opportunity could close for good. What came back, once the request was granted, was worse, far worse than anyone on Mark's side had let themselves expect. More than 60 vehicles, 3 full years of operation, each one logged with the same brutal, clinical precision estimated asset value, projected storage fees, a calculated likelihood the owner would push back legally, specific financial pressure points that could be leveraged against them, designated transfer points for eventual auction, expected resale price down to the dollar, the name of the officer responsible for engineering each individual stop, and a documented bonus structure paid out for every single vehicle successfully processed through the pipeline. Mark's own entry sat there in the recovered file, plain and unadorned as a grocery list. Ducati Superleggera V4 out-of-county owner expected quick settlement elevated resale value. He read it standing alone in Helen's office at 11 at night, and something in his chest went very, very still. Han hadn't been an accident. Han hadn't even been a mistake. Han had been a line item on a spreadsheet, chosen the same way you'd choose stock for a shelf. Then the phone rang. It was Helen, and her voice carried the particular, unmistakable flatness of someone delivering news. She didn't know how to soften no matter how many times she'd rehearsed it on the drive over. Calvin Price, the retired watch repairman, the man who had spent 4 patient years rebuilding a Porsche alongside a wife who never lived to see it finished, had passed away that morning while still waiting for his hearing date. He never got his car back. He never got to hear a single person in a uniform admit to her, out loud, that it should never have been taken from him in the first place. Mark stood in his garage doorway when that call came through, the scrap of his father's handwriting still folded tight in his hand. 2 griefs sat down together in that same room at the exact same moment, one that belonged only to him, private and unshareable, and one that belonged to a man he had never once met but somehow understood completely, down to the bone. Neither needed to be spoken out loud. The silence between the two of them said everything that mattered. Douglas John's window to bury the truth had just closed down to a matter of hours, though he wouldn't understand that until it was already far too late to matter. He moved fast the second he learned the FBI had formally requested the Northline data. Orders went out that same night. Whispered over a burner phone, relocate the highest value vehicles under cover of darkness. Strip the plates down to bare metal. Physically separate the paperwork from the cars themselves. Burn whatever remaining physical files still existed. Wipe the backup terminal at the secondary lot clean. Get every single piece of the operation across the state line before midnight struck. The destination was an abandoned shipyard warehouse near Silver Ridge Lake, chosen specifically because, as far as John knew, not one living soul had any reason to ever look there. The FBI didn't have the address yet, but they had something. John had no idea. They possessed a 26-year-old dispatcher who was about to decide, for the second and final time, whether her silence was still worth whatever price her own conscience was charging her to keep it. Anna Monroe came back not because anyone convinced her justice was worth the risk, but because her sister looked her in the eye one evening and said something she couldn't unhear. "I'd rather take a year off school," her sister told her, "than know you stayed quiet just to keep paying for it." That was the whole argument. It was enough. Anna handed Helen everything this time, and didn't flinch halfway through. The warehouse address, a hand-drawn layout, the gate code, the location of the records room, the exact departure window for the convoy, a photo, pulled before the servers went dark, of the Ducati under its own line item, time-stamped, every piece cross-checked against the recovered Northline data and the warehouse's own electricity billing, which showed a spike that lined up with John's timeline down to the hour. The FBI moved fast. Agents laid out the full chain for a judge in a neighboring federal district, chosen specifically to avoid any conflict with Mark's own bench, the dash footage, Samuel's video, the Tau dispatch predating the theft report by 12 minutes, the falsified serial number claim, the Northline data, Anna's statement, the financial ties between department and towing company, the coordinated midnight transfer, the digital fingerprints of files deleted in real time. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was a stack of documents so tall no one could talk their way out from under it. The warrant was signed before sunrise. The convoy at the shipyard warehouse was just pulling the first trailer toward the gate when the headlights hit them, sudden and blinding from every direction. Inside, the scene told its own story. Calvin Price's restored Porsche sat chained to a flatbed, heavier now with a weight no one there could see. The weight of a man who never lived to hear it was his again. A stripped motorcycle belonging to a man named Derek had its plates half torn off. A van that had belonged to a woman named Jasmine sat half-taped for a fresh coat of paint meant to erase its identity. Dozens of ownership files sat stacked beside an industrial shredder. Midfeed. Keller stood over a bike, flashlight in hand, checking a frame number that no longer mattered. Vance was halfway to a sedan, a hard drive tucked under one arm. John had a pen in his hand, signing a transfer log. When the warehouse lights flooded white, federal agents sealed the gate before a single vehicle could roll through it. The room went cemetery silent, no engines, no radios, nothing but the hum of overhead lights and the sound of a hard drive hitting concrete as Vance's hands stopped working correctly. Keller's flashlight dropped to the floor and stayed there, shaking, throwing a small circle of light on nothing at all. The lead agent walked directly to Keller and held the warrant out at arm's length. "From this moment," he said, "you're the one who needs to be verified." It landed exactly the way it was meant to, almost the same words Keller himself had once used on a man kneeling beside his own motorcycle at a quiet checkpoint, now handed back to him with the full weight of federal law behind it. Keller didn't have an answer. His mouth opened once and produced nothing. He turned toward the wall on his own, hands already lifting. Vance's hard drive was pulled from him before he'd finished processing what was happening. John was read his rights standing beside the transfer log he'd just signed, the pen still in his hand, his face draining of color that had nothing to do with the cold warehouse air. The owner of Summit Elite Recovery was cuffed inside his own building, surrounded by everything he'd taken from people who'd had no idea, until this moment, that any of it had a name, a program, a scoring system, a bonus structure built on other people's desperation. Ask yourself, watching men who spent months explaining away every lie with confident, procedural language. Does watching them finally go silent feel like justice? Or does it feel too small for what they took? Comment your honest reaction below. Mark wasn't there. That absence was deliberate. And it mattered. How was home when Helen called with the news? Sitting in the same garage where he'd found his father's note. Phone pressed to his ear in the dark. I didn't rush to watch 4 men lowered onto the ground in handcuffs under floodlights. I didn't need the image of his own vindication staged in front of him. Because the truth was simpler and harder than that. This was never about a federal judge arriving in time to save himself. It was about evidence nobody in that warehouse had managed to burn fast enough, coming from people with no title at all. A Tau dispatcher terrified for her sister's future, a retired teacher who wouldn't lower his phone, or a lawyer who noticed one business filing that didn't add up. They weren't defeated because of who Mark turned out to be. They were defeated by what they had written down themselves, believing no one would ever read it back to them. The trial moved through 4 levels of responsibility, though not all needed the same amount of daylight. John and the owner of Summit Elite Recovery faced the heaviest charges: conspiracy, money laundering, auction fraud, witness intimidation, obstruction. They were the architects. And the verdict, months later, reflected that. A handful of warehouse and auction staff who'd known vehicles were held unlawfully but processed them anyway received lighter sentences, scaled to how much they'd known and how fast they'd cooperated once the case broke. Anna Munro's part came last, and was hardest for her to sit through. On the stand, she didn't get to simply be the whistleblower who did the right thing. The prosecutor made her say it all out loud that she'd known for weeks before saying anything, that she'd taken her statement back once already out of fear, that people had kept losing their vehicles during the window. She stayed silent. The prosecution recommended a suspended sentence with mandatory community service, explicitly noting for the record that her decision to come back had preserved evidence that would otherwise have been destroyed. Anna didn't walk out looking like a hero. She walked out with a real sentence, a lighter one, and a sentence of her own for Helen in the hallway. "I know I should have said something on day one," she said. Helen didn't tell her it was fine. She just nodded, because some things don't need forgiving out loud to be understood. The case the jury remembered most was Keller and Vance, side by side at the defense table. The morning the prosecution played the dashcam audio out loud in open court. Keller's voice fills the room first, small and tinny, exactly as it had sounded on a quiet Saturday morning that had felt, to him, like nothing at all. "Place your bets. That thing is not where it's supposed to be. Look at him." No one laughed this time. 12 jurors sat with that sentence in a room where its full cost finally had a face, a folded note in a garage. A man named Calvin who never got his car back before he died. A joke that took 11 months, 60 vehicles, and one man's life to finish paying for. Then, the prosecutor put 2 timestamps on the courtroom screen side by side, the tow dispatch order, and the serial number complaint filed nearly an hour later, after Mark was already in cuffs. She let the jury sit with the gap in silence before saying another word. When the defense attorney asked Mark why he hadn't identified himself as a federal judge the moment things went wrong, he answered without raising his voice. "My registration wasn't more valid because of my profession," he said. "And what they did wasn't any less wrong once they found out who I was. If my title is the only thing that makes wrongdoing visible, this court has already failed everyone who doesn't have one." When asked why he'd continued pursuing the case even after his bike was returned, quietly, with no charges filed, he said the one thing that had always been true, "Because they gave it back to buy my silence. The people without a title still haven't gotten their lives back. Some of them never will." Keller was sentenced hardest among the officers, the one who chose the target, whose joke started the machine turning. Vance received a lesser term, still real, still earned. Silver Ridge itself was placed under federal oversight checkpoints, seizures, towing contracts, storage procedures, all now watched by someone outside the department for the first time in years. John stood at his own sentencing and said nothing at all. "I didn't need to." The silence said it for him, the same cemetery silence that had filled the warehouse the night the gate closed behind him. Except now, no one was left signing paperwork. No one left believing their own story. It was over. Except for one thing none of them had thought about while destroying files and burning through the people underneath them, the parts that still had to be given back. The compensation fund was built from what was left once the case closed: seized assets, frozen auction accounts, property recovered from the men who organized it, and a settlement from the city of Silver Ridge itself. It went to returning vehicles wherever possible, refunding fees that never should have been charged, covering lost wages for people who'd missed shifts and lost jobs, clearing false violations off records, and funding legal costs for anyone still fighting to get their name back. For most, the fund did what money can do. It couldn't do everything. Calvin Price's family gathered in a small courtroom annex months after his death. The restored Porsche parked just outside, sunlight catching the paint he and his late wife had chosen together, years before either could have imagined it would be taken from it. Alongside the car came a formal acknowledgement that the seizure had been unlawful, that Calvin Price had done nothing wrong, that the state was, belatedly, sorry. I wasn't there to hear it. His daughter ran her hand along the hood the way her father used to, and said nothing for a long moment, because a correct verdict delivered years too late can't undo what it cost to arrive. Nora Benson got her pickup back in the first wave of returns, along with 2 months of back pay. She kept working the overnight shift. She still parks in the same spot, closest to the light. The Ducati went back to its garage in the quiet edges of Atlanta, and its meaning had changed depending on who was asked to explain it. To the men who built the Priority Asset Verification Program, it had never been more than a number, a projected resale value. A line item, worth the risk of stopping. To Mark Cole, it had always been something else. A father's last gift. A symbol of a family that worked with its hands and never acted like it deserved anything it hadn't earned. The place where the first 14% of evidence had quietly saved his life. The key that unlocked an operation built on the assumption that no one who looked like him would ever be believed. He still rides it. Some mornings before court, he takes the long way in, past the same stretch of road near Silver Ridge Lake. Engine low, nothing left to prove to anyone watching. What happened there left behind more than a verdict. It left a lesson the case never stated outright, but that everyone who lived through it understood by the end. Wrongdoing never depended on who the victim turned out to be. Keller and Vance were wrong the moment they chose Mark based on nothing but a bias dressed up as instinct, not the moment they discovered who he was. If he'd been anyone else, anyone without a title, anyone without the means to fight back for over a year, the outcome would have been the same crime with a quieter ending. Modern corruption rarely announces itself. Nobody in that department ever called themselves a thief. They used the language of procedure inspections, verifications, safety holds to make theft sound like diligence. That's what made it hard to stop and easy to believe, even for the people doing it. Independent evidence can outlast a system built to lie about itself. It wasn't a judge's title that brought the whole thing down. It was a dashcam recording nobody could delete in time, a retired teacher who wouldn't lower his phone, a legal filing nobody thought to hide, a server sitting quietly out of the department's reach. When enough separate truths point at the same thing, power runs out of language flexible enough to call it a misunderstanding. A whistleblower's courage doesn't erase the cost of the silence that came before it. Anna Monroe wasn't turned into a flawless hero by the end, and the court didn't pretend otherwise. She admitted, out loud, that she'd known, that she'd stayed quiet, that she'd taken it back once out of fear. Coming forward late still saved lives. It still had a price, and she paid part of it herself. And the biggest reversal in this story was never Mark's title. It was his decision not to stop once he alone was safe. He never stood above the law because of the power he held. I used what he understood about the law to make it answer. Finally, to people who never had any power to begin with. Mark Cole didn't win because he was a federal judge. I won because the moment the system recognized his power, he refused to spend it only on himself. The Ducati sits back in that garage tonight. The same red paint catching the same overhead light. Somewhere inside that house. Folded and untouched. His father's note still rests exactly where he found it. A reminder he doesn't need to read out loud anymore. Because he already carries what it says. The fight isn't finished the day one person gets his bike back. It's finished the day people with no title at all get their property back, their names back, and the right to be believed the first time, not the second. Maybe you've never been stopped on a motorcycle, and maybe you'll never wear a robe in a federal courtroom. But almost everyone watching this has had a moment where someone looked at them and decided, before a single word was spoken, exactly how much respect they deserved. What was that moment for you, and how did you prove them wrong? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story reminded you that character will always outlast someone else's first impression of you, ID subscribe and stay with this channel because there's another story, just like this one, waiting for you next week. And we'd love to have you here for it.